Hi, this is History with me, Dan Sterner. What you are about to watch is a compilation of 8 of my videos about the historic Lost Riverfront area of Hartford, Connecticut. These were historic areas that dated back to the earliest days of the city. They went through some dramatic transformations over the years. First, in the 1870s, when the Valley Railroad came through. Then, in the first decade of the 20th century, when the Bulkeley Bridge and Connecticut Boulevard were created. And then in the mid-20th century, when the interstate highways came through and Hartford's Old East Side was cleared for the construction of Constitution Plaza. These 8 videos were made over a period of over 4 years. And forgive me if there's some overlap between them. They cover different subjects that sometimes converge, with some of the videos going into more detail than some of the other videos. The first video gives an overview of the effects of the construction of the Bulkeley Bridge and Connecticut Boulevard, which had dramatic impacts on areas around the foot of Morgan, Ferry, and State Streets, and along the old Commerce Street. The second video goes into more detail about the lower section of State Street from Front Street right up to the Connecticut River. The third video focuses on some of the very oldest buildings that would have been at the very foot of State Street along the Connecticut River. The fourth video goes into more detail about some of the old houses and warehouses that were along Commerce Street between State Street and Ferry Street. The fifth video goes into more detail about some of the subjects in the previous videos, giving longer quotes from newspaper accounts about the Lost Riverfront area. The last 3 videos focus on Dutch Point, which was the peninsula where the old Park, Little, or Hog River, as it was variously called, met the Connecticut River. The first gives general background about Dutch Point from colonial times. The second one focuses on the great log drives down the Connecticut River, during which some of the logs made it all the way down to Hartford at Dutch Point. And the last video looks to the 20th century and the lost Dutch Point Power Station. So please enjoy this look back at Hartford's lost riverfront area. And remember to subscribe and hit the like button, leave a comment, leave a super thanks, and even consider hitting the join button. So let's get started with the first video. Hartford, Connecticut is a city that went through a great deal of urban renewal in the mid-20th century. One well-known example is what happened to the old East Side neighborhood, which included Front Street and was home to generations of immigrants. The East Side was demolished to make way for the construction of Constitution Plaza. Around the same time, the interstate highways were built. They cut through many sections of the city and separated downtown Hartford from the Connecticut River. But a half-century before the building of Constitution Plaza and the highway, an earlier redevelopment project had already started the process of altering the Old East Side in the name of civic improvement. This project, which was connected to the building of the Bulkeley Bridge in the first decade of the 20th century, dramatically altered the old Hartford riverfront between Morgan Street and State Street. Hartford and East Hartford were once connected by a covered wooden bridge built in 1818. It was destroyed by a fire on May 17, 1895. Its eventual replacement would be a great stone arch bridge, which we know today as the Bulkeley Bridge. Plans for its design were selected in 1903, and construction was completed in 1908. During this period, the city also undertook the creation of a scenic boulevard on either side of the bridge that would form an appropriately grand approach to the capital city. Called Connecticut Boulevard, it has since been replaced by highways on the Hartford side. It still exists on the East Hartford side, although it's now lined with car dealerships. To create this new boulevard on the Hartford side, the bridge commissioners removed most of the last traces of the old riverfront area in what was the city's largest urban renewal project up to that time. This civic improvement was part of the City Beautiful movement that was flourishing at the time. As George E. Wright wrote in his 1908 book Crossing the Connecticut, quote, "This beautiful bridge and boulevard and the vast improvements involved in their construction have completely transformed the riverfront of the city from a condition of filth and squalor to one of cleanliness and neatness, and the whole work stands as a grand memorial to the wisdom and enterprise of the Bridge Commission, loyally supported by the citizenship of Hartford," unquote. This video will look at some of the old traces of Hartford's past that were lost in this first instance of major urban renewal on the east side. This is a view of Hartford's old east side from the bird's eye view of the city published in 1877. The view looks towards the west, so the Connecticut River on the east is at the bottom of the image. It shows the old wooden bridge that would burn down in 1895. The bridge led to Morgan Street, which ran westwards up to Main Street. Parallel to that on the south was State Street, which stretched between the riverfront to the area of the old State House. Running north and south was the famous Front Street, now Columbus Boulevard, the heart of the old East Side neighborhood. East of that, closer to the river, was Commerce Street, a dirt road that was quite a bit rougher in real life than this bird's eye view would indicate. Running parallel with Commerce Street is the track of the Connecticut Valley Railroad, which opened in 1871 along the west bank of the Connecticut River. In 1880, it became the Hartford and Connecticut Valley Railroad and would later be leased to the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad. Between the tracks and the river were the old wharves and warehouses, some of which dated back to the days of the old West India trade. From later times, there was a coal yard and the railroad freight yards. All of this would be swept away as part of the new development. This diagram shows what was planned for the transformation of the area. The old Commerce Street would be replaced by a new Connecticut Boulevard. Travelers crossing the bridge into Hartford could now traverse south on this grand thoroughfare, which made a gentle curve to join State Street. Then they proceeded west along State to reach Main Street around the area of the old State House. A rump of the old Commerce Street still existed, extending south of State Street. The railroad tracks were adjusted to accommodate this new boulevard, and a new east side passenger station was erected adjacent to the new curve. To beautify the area, old buildings were demolished along the river, as well as on the west of the new boulevard. Buildings were also demolished on the north side of Morgan Street to make way for newly constructed replacement railroad freight yards. Returning to the 1877 bird's eye view, let's look more closely at what was lost to all of this development. Zooming in along the river were the railroad's old freight yards. As I mentioned, the replacement yards were built on the north side of Morgan Street. Moving to that area, these are some of the buildings that were razed. Other old buildings at Morgan and Commerce had already been lost when the railroad was built through here in 1871. Now the remaining buildings in this picture were to go. One of them has an advertisement for You Need a Biscuit. The other building displays advertisements for 2 theatrical performances. The Man Who Dared played at the Hartford Opera House in 1902 and 1903. It was a melodrama written by and starring Howard Hall, who, in one dramatic scene, jumps into a den of lions to rescue a lady's glove. On the south side of Morgan Street, between Front Street and Charles Street, was a century-old structure called the Old Yellow Block or the Pallotti Building. This century-old building was demolished to accommodate the widening of Morgan Street that was part of the approach to the new bridge. The block was built circa 1810 by John Morgan to serve as residences at a time when some of the finest buildings in the city were located in the vicinity. Several decades later, the wealthy had moved away, and the neighborhood had become home to waves of new immigrants. The building then served as a tenement house with shops on the first floor. About 1879, Nicholas Pallotti, recently arrived from Italy, purchased the building, where he lived and kept a meat market. Over the years, he would become a wealthy banker and property owner, and eventually he moved out of the building, but he still owned it and rented it as housing for other Italian immigrants. Sadly, by the first decade of the 20th century, the building was in a dilapidated condition. But when the Bridge Commission attempted to purchase the property, Pallotti demanded $100,000 for it. After years of delay and with the grand opening of the new bridge imminent, the structure was finally taken by a condemnation proceeding. Pallotti eventually agreed to accept over $50,000 for the building, which he had originally bought for under $10,000. He then commenced to take down the building himself. He and a group of workmen began by clearing out colonies of rats which had taken up residence in some of the outbuildings. A large number of rodents then began pouring from the area. Some of them even tried to run across the bridge to the East Hartford side of the river. Hordes of children gathered around to watch the spectacle. As the Hartford Courant reported on March 18, 1908, quote, "In the building where Pallotti will start his work soon, there were other evidences that the rats were not taking kindly to the change. The Italians who have been tearing down a few fixtures preparatory to the general shakedown came downstairs with big stories of the terrible whiskered rats that were continually popping into sight from most everywhere. The building, which until recently was devoted to tenement purposes, is an ideal breeding place for the rats. The garret is full of them, and they are scattered all over the rest of the structure, from roof to cellar. Down there are some old whoppers that come out in the night and put cats on the defensive. Indoors, the Pallotti block bears evidence of the many years of hard usage to which it has been subjected. The almost interminable passageways are poorly lighted and show lack of cleanliness. Upstairs, the floors are covered with mold and soot, and the smell of a charnel house pervades the whole deserted block. The tenants in the end of the structure on Front Street that is still inhabited have been warned to leave by the 1st of next month. Pallotti declares he will take the building down himself, but believes it will be a long, wearisome job." Unquote. Along the river, next to the railroad freight yards, were warehouses dating back to 1808, when the West India trade was still flourishing. This had continued to be a bustling area in the vicinity of the Ferry Street slip through the mid-19th century. It was a center of commerce where farmers brought produce and patronized many local businesses alongside sailors and fishermen. There was a ship's chandlery, grocery stores, saloons, and hotels nearby. For years, the area had been a center for fish markets, which were taken down when the railroad came through in 1871. For many years, Asa Farwell, famed for his cherry rum, kept a wholesale and retail liquor business in a warehouse he'd erected in 1840 at the corner of Commerce and Ferry Street. In this view, looking north up Commerce Street, Farwell's old building is on the left. It would be demolished to make way for the new boulevard. Across Commerce Street is a building with an Italianate-style cupola. This was constructed in 1871 at the end of the row of warehouses on the site of a grocery business that had burned down. Called the River House, it served as a hotel for many years. This picture from 1884 shows members of the Hartford Canoe Club in front of the building. Further down the river is the old steamboat dock, which would survive the 1908 improvements. In this postcard from circa 1910, the steamboat dock is on the left, and on the right is the railroad station, built as part of the new development. It replaced the original Valley Branch station built by Edwin Taylor in 1835. Returning to the buildings that were demolished to make way for the new Connecticut Boulevard, the buildings on Commerce Street, south of Farwell's warehouse, were taken down, along with some on the north side of State Street, to allow the bend or curve in the road that would link Connecticut Boulevard with State. Going back to the view looking north up Commerce Street, the building on the far left is labeled T.J. Blake and Son. They were brass founders and coppersmiths. Here's a view looking south with the railroad tracks along the riverside on the left and Commerce Street heading to State Street on the right. T.J. Blake and Son is on the far right of this picture. Just south of it are two houses. These were built in the early 19th century by John Pantry Jones and Watson Bacon, back when some of the finest homes in Hartford were still located near the river. By the time they were to be torn down about a century later, the white brick house had an unsavory reputation in the neighborhood, according to the Hartford Courant. This is a view looking west, up State Street, towards the old post office building, which back then blocked the old State House from view. Commerce Street comes in on the right, with T.J. Blake and the two houses on the street's west side. To create the curve that connected Connecticut Boulevard and State Street, the buildings at the corner of Commerce Street had to be taken down. For a time, this corner had been the headquarters of a trucking business and was known as Carman's Corner. This is a view of the same area during one of the many floods that for years so often affected this area close to the river. This picture shows the view looking east down State Street towards Commerce Street. The building on the far left would survive the new development and last until the 1950s. But all of the other buildings here on the north side of State Street would be demolished to create the bend in the road. This is part of a postcard that shows the completed curve and where the buildings that were demolished had stood. Expanding to the full postcard, it shows what the completed Connecticut Boulevard looked like and how thorough all the demolition had been. This is another postcard view of the same area. This is a section of the Hartford Atlas of 1896, before the area was changed, showing the intersection of Commerce and State Streets. You can compare it with the Atlas of 1909. The buildings that I've X'd out on the left were demolished to create the bend on the right. Zooming out, the atlas shows the area after all the clearances had been completed. Things would remain much like this for almost another half-century. That was when every building shown on this map was demolished to make way for the highways and Constitution Plaza. So here's another comparison. This is the east side and the riverfront area after the urban renewal of the first decade of the 20th century that accompanied the building of the Bulkeley Bridge. And here's the same area after the urban renewal of the 1950s and 60s. At the foot of State Street in Hartford, Connecticut, is the ramp that passes over I-91 and connects to the Founders Bridge that crosses the Connecticut River. Just south of it is the elevated plaza that leads to Mortenson Riverfront Plaza. Before the bridge was built in 1957, though, this section of State Street east of Front Street looked very different. This is a view of the old east side of Hartford during the flood of 1936. The heart of this neighborhood, which was home to generations of immigrants until it was all demolished in the late 1950s to make way for redevelopment, was Front Street, which ran north and south parallel to the Connecticut River. Front Street intersected with State Street, which ran eastwards from Main Street and the old State House to the Connecticut River. In this video, I'm going to talk about the lost buildings and businesses that used to exist on State Street east of the intersection with Front Street. For decades, this would have been the first part of Hartford encountered by visitors arriving by steamboat or on the old Valley Railroad. With the construction of the Bulkeley Bridge, Connecticut Boulevard was also created as a thoroughfare, linking that bridge to the foot of State Street. Early on, the area was a center of Hartford's trade with the West Indies. It also became home to numerous warehouses of the Connecticut Valley's tobacco industry. Before we get started, if you enjoy this video, please consider hitting the like button. Also, I would really appreciate it if you would subscribe to the channel, which will help support more content like this video. This is a picture of the intersection of State Street and Front Street in 1906. The view is westward, looking toward the old post office building that used to stand next to the old State House. The picture on the left was taken from a little further east, showing buildings on the south side of State Street. At the time of this photograph, changes were being made to the street grade of State Street in connection with the building of the Bulkeley Bridge. The building on the southwest corner of State and Front is shown in both pictures. The building on the southeast corner, 205 to 207 State Street, was the home of a long-lived paper company. Begun in 1864 by E.J. Carroll, it was taken over in 1877 by Carroll's brother-in-law, Patrick Garvin. Born in Ireland in 1836, Garvin came to America in 1851 and eventually went into business as a contractor and builder in East Hartford. He erected many buildings east of the river in both East Hartford and Manchester, and there's a street named for him in East Hartford. After he took over his brother-in-law's company, he continued it under his own name and developed it into one of the leading retailers of paper products in the country. Patrick Garvin also owned several paper mills, and he entered politics as well, representing East Hartford in the state legislature in the 1880s, and being elected a state senator in 1890. Serving on Hartford's Board of Park Commissioners, he was instrumental in creating Riverside Park. After his death in 1912, the company P. Garvin Incorporated was led by his son, Thomas F. Garvin. Among their products was Nabob toilet paper. The building itself had to be rebuilt after a fire in 1887. Next door were other 19th century commercial buildings at 209 to 211 State Street and 213 to 217 State Street. For this next photo, we've turned to a view east down State Street towards the Connecticut River. The buildings I just mentioned are on the right. Next east of these was a somewhat grander building at 219 to 221 State Street. A previous building on the site, which seems to have been a tobacco warehouse, appears in a photograph of the area from 1868 or thereabouts. For many years, this building and the ones on either side of it were home to either grocery stores or tobacco warehouses, the latter eventually predominating. But by the early 1920s, a hotel occupied this building, which in 1926 became Gaylord Brothers Hotel. Alfred E. Gaylor left his job as an assistant buyer of rugs and carpets at Brown Thompson's to help his brother John in the new business. After John died in World War II, Adolf and his new partner Harold Toland continued to run the hotel until it was finally torn down in 1957. The hotel was described by the Hartford Courant as, quote, a home for stevedores and tobacco workers, drinkers and drifters, and various other unfortunate persons for 30 years, unquote. Gaylor later said he always tried to give his customers wholesome food and clean rooms, which in the 1920s were 25 cents a night, which eventually rose to 60 cents before the hotel finally closed. The transients who stayed there called it the Old Homestead. By the time it was demolished, the upper floors were lined with cardboard and wooden cubicles where the men slept. Inspecting the building for demolition, a lieutenant from the local fire marshal's office dismissively said, "The bums will leave Hartford now. They've lost their palace." Adolf Gaylor himself expressed great sympathy, however, once saying, "I never looked down on these boys. I figured they needed somebody to understand them and listen to them." Let's turn to the other side of the street, the north side. Part of this block was owned by the Williams and Carlton Company. Before we get to that, let's do a three-way turn from an earlier image. So this was a view west up State Street. Now we've turned to look north up Front Street. Williams and Carlton is on the right. And now we're going to turn again to look east down State Street from Front Street. There's a prominent sign for Garvin paper, which I mentioned earlier. In the early 20th century, the three buildings on the left had come to be owned by the Williams and Carlton Company. The company started here at the corner of State and Front Street in 1825 as a retail drugstore conducted by Dr. Isaac D. Bull. At that time, the East Side was a very affluent neighborhood. The company went through various partnerships, eventually becoming Williams and Carlton and evolving into a wholesaler of grocery specialties. It was known for Williams flavoring extracts, which included root beer and vanilla. After just over a century of operating in the same location in Hartford, the company moved in the 1920s to a new facility on Connecticut Boulevard in East Hartford, and then moved to Boston in the 1930s. Here's a picture of the former Williams and Carlton buildings during the flood of 1936. And here's a close-up on the corner of State and Front. On the ground floor on the Front Street side were the Good Fit Uniform Company, run by Samuel Rosenbaum, and the State Pharmacy, owned by Frank Uricchio and Daniel J. Ricci. Here are those storefronts in the immediate aftermath of the flood. The flood was devastating, but these two businesses reopened 3 months later with refurbished stores and new stock. Returning to our elevated view of the flooding, the buildings I've just been talking about were just east of Front Street. East of those were the three buildings at 216, 218, and 220 State Street. By 1936, these had been enlarged from the three-story row that had existed here 30 years earlier. On the right is an even earlier photo from 1884 of the building at 216 State Street. Among the businesses here then were E. H. Betts, dealer in salt and fish, and Francis C. Sturdivant, who made chicken feed under the name Imperial Egg Food. When the image on the left was taken in 1908, the advertisement covering the third floor of the building had been removed. This is a view west up State Street, another one that was taken when work was being done to change the grade of the street. On the far right is the wholesale grocery business of Tulin, Toft, and Tulin, which moved into the building at 222, 224, and 226 State Street in 1905. The partners acquired the building from Patrick Garvin, who I mentioned earlier. He owned a lot of real estate in the area. The company was named for the partners Shia D. Tulin, Lazarus Toft, and Samuel S. Tulin. The senior partner, Shia D. Tulin, was a leader in Hartford's Jewish community. He was born in 1849 in Tomsk, Poland, which is now in Belarus. He came to America in 1886 and was first a farmer in Colchester for 10 years before coming to Hartford at the age of 49 to be head of the grocery company. He was president until 1916 and died at the age of 90 in 1938. The upper floors of the building were used by another business as a tobacco warehouse, one of many in the vicinity. The previous tenant in the building had been Joseph G. Lane, a very popular Hartford personality. For years he ran a wholesale liquor business and had Mark Twain as one of his customers. Lane had greatly expanded the building from what it had been before. Going back in time, here's the Lane Tulin building on the left in 1906. On the right is a view from a flood in 1862. It shows the gable-fronted brownstone building that existed before Lane altered it. Next east were the two buildings at 228 and 230 State Street. Here they are as well in a view of the 1908 street work. The building at 228 State had a distinctive triple-arched entrance. The building at 230 State had a gable front. By 1899, Patrick Garvin, the builder and paper manufacturer who I mentioned earlier, owned these buildings. In 1915, Thomas Trant, a dealer in wholesale plumbing supplies, who had been renting 228 to 230 State Street, purchased the property from Garvin's heirs. In 1916, Trant's brother Morris became his partner, and the company became Thomas Trant and Brother. It would grow to have one of the largest stocks of heating and plumbing supplies in New England. The rest of the buildings to the east of 228 to 230 State Street were demolished in 1905 to make way for the curve that linked the new Connecticut Boulevard to State Street. This was all associated with the urban renewal that occurred during the building of the Bulkeley Bridge. This is a picture of the buildings at the corner of State and Commerce Street that were sadly demolished to create that curve. In this aerial view of Hartford in the 1920s, the Trant building was still there just west of the curve. And here's a picture of the Trant building and the curve in the 1950s. With the construction of the Founders Bridge in 1957, Trant and Brother moved to a new building on Van Block Avenue that is now a storage facility for the Connecticut State Library. Across the street, on the south side of State Street, was the old Gaylord Hotel that I mentioned earlier. Just east of that were the remaining buildings on State Street that were demolished to make way for the ramps of the Founders Bridge. The buildings on the right were occupied by Lou Barron's Furniture Mart, which would soon move further west up State Street. The tall building in the middle of the block was erected in 1906 for A&S Hartman tobacco growers. The company was started by Adolf and Samuel Hartman, Jewish immigrants from Germany who settled in Manchester and opened a dry goods store in that town. After buying a tobacco crop from a farmer as payment of a debt, they got into the tobacco growing business. They became pioneers in growing the new hybrid known as shade tobacco. They bought land in the Buckland section of Manchester to start their growing operation, and in later years they bought additional land in the Connecticut Valley, including acreage in Windsor, Bloomfield, Enfield, and Suffield. The founding brothers died in the 1920s. Pictured in this advert are the next generation, Adolph's son-in-law, Albert Newfield, and Samuel's son, Morris. In 1928, they formed the Hartman Tobacco Company, a merger of A&S Hartman with two other companies, one of which was Stern Hartman and Company, established in 1906 by a group of partners that included Adolph's sons Gustav and Emmanuel. The Connecticut shade tobacco industry boomed in the first half of the 20th century, and soon every building shown in this photograph and many others nearby were used as tobacco warehouses. For years, every September, thousands of men, women, and children would throng the area warehouses seeking employment for the tobacco sorting season. Let's talk about the remaining buildings from the Hartman Building to the Connecticut River. The photo on the left, from 1908, shows the buildings that preceded the Hartman warehouse. Next to that were the last two buildings on the block that existed before everything went down in 1957. But a half-century earlier, there was a white-painted building just to the east. On the right is another photograph of that building, which was home to one of the East Side's many saloons. And this view faces west up State Street with the white building on the left. For this next image, we've moved even further east, past the intersection with Commerce Street. The building on the left with the tower, located at the southeast corner of State and Commerce, was another saloon, Wilson's Cafe. Now we've turned to another view of that building, looking south down Commerce Street during the flood of 1909. The warehouse just west of the saloon was built in 1820 by David and Dudley Buck, and used by the Buck propeller line of steamboats until 1862. Now we have turned to a view eastwards, towards the railroad tracks and the Connecticut River beyond. The photo on the left shows the same area a few years before, just after Wilson's Saloon had been devastated by a fire in 1904. The business had a long history. Wilson had owned it for a decade at the time of the fire, but before that it had been operated by George Washburn for 40 years as a restaurant famous for its shore dinners. Wilson would discontinue the restaurant, but continue the business as a saloon. After the fire, he replaced his burnt-out saloon with the Italianate-style building I already mentioned. A little further east, right next to the train tracks, was the old Valley Railroad Station. It was actually built long before the railroad came, however, in 1835 by Edwin Taylor, father of Samuel Taylor, who would take many photographs of Hartford. Edwin Taylor ran a grocery store here that catered to the steamship passengers who passed through here on their way between Hartford and New York. The roof of the building blew off during a high wind in 1837, and the discouraged Mr. Taylor decided to give up the grocery business and go into the lumber business instead. Years later, in about 1870, the building was sold to the Valley Railroad and used as its station until a new one was built in 1907. On the left is a section of the bird's-eye view of Hartford of 1877, showing the Valley Railroad Station. Just to the north, across State Street, were several shack-like buildings that also appear in the photograph on the left. This photograph was taken in the 1860s, before the railroad tracks were built. A building taken down for those tracks is pictured here. It was the old West India warehouse of Eliphalet and Roderick Terry. In the early 19th century, rum and molasses would arrive at their adjacent river dock. This building had been gone about a decade when the 1877 bird's eye view was created. Just east of the railroad tracks was the steamboat dock on the Connecticut River. Imagine a time when steamboats regularly came here. Here's a view southwards along the train tracks with the dock on the left. And here's a slightly later postcard. By this time, the new station of the Valley branch of the New York, New Haven, and Hartford Railroad had been built. This photograph is a view westwards from the river, with the new station on the right. The silhouette of the old station, by then torn down, is visible on the left. And in the distance is that building at the corner of State Street that I talked about before, long the home of Thomas Trant and Brother. It, like everything else, would eventually be torn down by 1957. Here's an elevated view of the area I've been talking about, taken in about 1958, when all the buildings were gone. The Founders Bridge had been built and construction of the new highway was underway. Long gone were the days of trains and steamboats, of West India rum and Connecticut shade tobacco, of sellers of liquor and plumbing supplies, and of manufacturers of paper and vanilla extract. Constitution Plaza and the Phoenix Building would soon rise just to the west, and the area east of Front Street and north of State Street would become the home of 1980s office buildings. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. In this video, I'm going to talk about some of the old buildings and a notable tree that once existed during Hartford, Connecticut's great period as a prosperous river port. This era began at the end of the 18th century and lasted into the mid-19th century. This 1869 bird's eye view of Hartford by John Bachman shows the city's active riverfront with numerous sailing ships and steamboats. But at the time of this image, the heyday of the river traffic was already passing, and just 2 years later, the Valley Railroad was constructed right through this docklands area, parallel to the river. Fortunately, some of the structures that were lost to the coming of the railroad, or shortly thereafter, were photographed in the 1860s, providing us with a glimpse of the wharfs, warehouses, and fish markets that were once a staple of Hartford's riverfront. So let's explore these traces of the city's riverborne trade of over 200 years ago. This section, from the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford, shows the heart of Hartford's riverfront, not long after the railway came through. Located between State Street on the south to the left and Morgan Street on the north to the right were numerous wharves and warehouses. Morgan Street itself led to the old wooden covered bridge that existed for many years before it burned down in a fire and was replaced by the Bulkeley Bridge. The rough and tumble Commerce Street ran northwards just west of the river. As I've described in another video that I'll link in the description below and at the end of this video, Commerce Street would be replaced in 1908 by Connecticut Boulevard, which connected the new bridge to the foot of State Street. Its construction would result in further losses of old buildings connected to the river trade. The train tracks were built in 1871 just east of Commerce Street, and like the later Boulevard and Interstate highways, its arrival also led to the destruction of traces of earlier times. This 1877 view shows a series of coal sheds used for steamboats. These sheds were on the north side of State Street between Commerce on the west and the railroad on the east. These sheds are also shown on the left in this photograph from the mid-1860s, which is a view to the northeast from State Street. Just to the east, on the right, is a 3-story gambrel-roofed building with a gable-roofed extension. It stood right where the railroad would come through a few years after this photo was taken. This building was the old West India storehouse of the merchants Eliphalet and Roderick Terry. Eliphalet and Roderick were brothers, the sons of Judge Eliphalet Terry of Enfield. In 1795, the younger Eliphalet came to work at a store owned by a Mr. Church at the intersection of Main Street and Albany Avenue. After Church's death, Terry took over the store and brought in his brother Roderick as a partner. The grocery firm of E&R Terry continued until 1830, when Eliphalet retired, and the business was succeeded by the Keeney brothers, who later built the Keeney Clock Tower. Eliphalet then served as president of the Hartford Fire Insurance Company. In December of 1835, after a massive fire destroyed New York City's financial district and threatened the Hartford with huge losses, Terry pledged his own property as security to ensure that all the company's drafts would be honored. He then rushed to the city in a sleigh to assure everyone that all claims would be paid, and he also offered to sell new policies, all of which restored confidence. This led to the dominance of the New York fire insurance market by Hartford-based companies. Eliphalet's brother Roderick Terry and his son Roderick Jr. later had their own business in the old warehouse at the foot of State Street, which, as I mentioned, was torn down to make way for the railroad. Just north of the Terry warehouse and the coal shacks was the fish market operated by Samuel Church, shown in this picture in the distance on the left. This photo, which is a view to the southeast, shows the fish market, which was at the foot of Ferry Street, in the foreground. As the Hartford Courant newspaper recalled in a 1904 description of the area, quote, "The locality was the headquarters of fish dealers. Nearly all the shad caught in the river was brought there, and boats filled with oysters and clams could always be found tied up to the docks." Unquote. The paper also noted that, quote, "the fish markets were mostly controlled by Sam and Bill Church. These markets were torn down when the Valley Railroad was built." Unquote. In 1879, Sam Church was killed when the buckboard wagon he was riding, heading up the section of Main Street that was then called Windsor Avenue, collided with a team going the other way that by chance was being driven by his brother William, who was out with his wife for an evening ride. Sam was thrown from the wagon after one of its wheels got stuck in the railroad track. Reporting his death, the Hartford Courant noted, quote, "In the shad season his familiar figure could always be seen under an awning by the riverside, and the excellence of his fish and his reasonable prices attracted a large custom. Mr. Church was one of the weightiest men in town. He was good-natured and jolly and had a pleasant word for everybody. He was well known and will be greatly missed," unquote. Just to the east of Church's Fish Market, next to the river, was another old West India warehouse with a gambrel roof. As indicated by a sign on the building, by the 1860s, it was owned by Chapin and Burr. A few decades earlier, as shown in this advertisement from 1840, this firm was known as M.W. Chapin and Company, flour, grain, and coal merchants, agents for a line of packet boats to Philadelphia. An editorial in the Hartford Courant on July 26, 1842, heralded the commencement of an iron-hulled steamboat line between Philadelphia and Chapin's Wharf in Hartford. These vessels utilized two screw propellers of the type recently invented by John Ericsson. As the editorial author wrote, quote, "The arrival of the Ironsides at this port may be regarded as the commencement of a new era in the coasting business of Hartford. If these boats work as well as it is confidently expected they will by those who have paid attention to the subject, we see nothing in the way of their setting all competition at defiance. They are peculiarly adapted for our river, as they are dependent neither on wind nor tide, and from their light draft will not be subject to toll," unquote. By the 1860s, M.W. Chapin and Company had become Chapin and Burr, commission merchants and agents for Philadelphia propellers. This photograph shows the east, or river-facing side, of the Chapin and Burr warehouse. Just south of it is Chapin's Wharf, extending into the river and laden with goods. In 1908, as the riverfront was being transformed with the erection of the Bulkeley Bridge, a Hartford Courant reporter, looking back on the old river days, noted, quote, "The Philadelphia propellers started from Chapin's Wharf, just north of State Street. While they did not usually carry passengers, there were accommodations for a few of the captain's friends. These freighters were slim and long and went to Philadelphia through the Raritan Canal. Their capacity was between 700 and 800 tons. Generally speaking, 2 of them were kept running, but in the busy season, a third was added to the line," unquote. In 1904, Chapin's son reminisced to a Courant reporter, quote, "During the Civil War, these boats were taken by the government and used to transport stores for the Army and Navy. At that time, Mr. Chapin replaced them with sloops, and after the war he got his propellers back again. He said he remembered the ship Chandlery, and it was south of the slip," unquote. But just as iron-hulled steamboats had taken the place of earlier sailing vessels, the railroads would come to supersede the old cargo traffic on the river. The Philadelphia line was withdrawn in about 1878. This photo was taken after the building of the Valley Railroad, whose elevated tracks are visible just behind the warehouse where the fish markets had once stood. Not all of the traces of the old days in this section of the riverfront were man-made. Another landmark, which is partially shown in all 3 of the photos I've been talking about, was photographed here by Frederick S. Brown in 1890. It was described by the Hartford Times in early 1883. Quote, "The oldest tree in Hartford since the fall of the Charter Oak is located a few feet south of the warehouse formerly occupied by M.W. Chapin at the foot of Ferry Street. It is a sycamore, or buttonball, and is known in the books as Platanus occidentalis, and by the English is called plane tree. It is 8 feet in diameter at the ground, and girts 22 feet 5 feet from its base. When the first explorer came up the Connecticut River, it stood on the high ground on the riverbank, and has been a familiar feature of that locality ever since. Its trunk is hollow, being a mere shell, just as it was when the writer of this paragraph first saw it over 50 years since. Its main limbs and branches were as sound and thrifty last season as they ever were. this grand old tree, that it has taken 300 or 400 years to produce, and the last of the old trees that antedate the history of our settlement, has had several narrow escapes of late. Last year the boys, in imitation of other boys that set fire to the old charter oak before its fall, built a bonfire inside of it, which would have been its end, but by the timely arrival of a fire engine it was saved. A few days since, David Connor, a resident of that neighborhood, got permission from President Babcock of the Valley Railroad, which company owns the land on which it stands, to cut it down for firewood. David had succeeded in cutting off a part of the main branches when the attention of Mr. Babcock was called to the fact of its historical importance as the oldest tree in Hartford, and he countermanded the order, and David will remove what he has cut down and give the old tree one more chance. Woodman, spare that tree, unquote. Later that year, the Current noted, quote, the oldest tree now alive in the city, General Gear thinks, stands a few rods south of and under the foot of Ferry Street. It is believed to be over 300 years old, is 24 feet in circumference at the base, and like the charter oak is hollow, and has been submitted to a fiery ordeal. It is a sycamore or button ball, unquote. I don't know when the tree finally came down, but both it and the old Chapin warehouse were gone by the mid-1890s. And, as I mentioned, a decade after that, the area was completely transformed to create Connecticut Boulevard, which of course has long since been replaced by I-84. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. In this video, I'm going to talk about some buildings that once stood near the riverfront in the city of Hartford, Connecticut. They were built during Hartford's heyday as a river port and were lost to redevelopment in the first decade of the 20th century. Today, the riverfront of Hartford, nearest to downtown, is a relatively quiet place, separated from the rest of the city by the interstate highway. One place where the urban landscape has been reconnected to the water is at Mortenson Riverfront Plaza, which links above the highway to the Connecticut Science Center and the nearby Convention Center. 185 years ago, when this scene was painted in 1841, the riverfront area was quite different. The river was the highway, a busy conduit for sailing ships and early steamboats, carrying cargo and passengers to the many wharves and warehouses along the river's bank. The streets leading away from the river towards downtown were filled with the businesses of merchant traders, and there were inns and numerous taverns. In the days before the railroads, or even before there was a bridge over the Connecticut here, travelers crossed to the city by ferry from East Hartford. Almost a century later, even after the construction of the Bulkeley Bridge, many still arrived by steamboat at the foot of State Street, and then went westwards towards the old State House and Main Street. That's why the main entrance to the old State House is not on the west side of the building, facing Main Street, but on the east side, facing the Connecticut River. The process that transformed the bustling waterfront of the early 19th century into what we are familiar with today took several generations, but there were a number of critical moments of change. One of these was the building of the Bulkeley Bridge, when old coal and freight yards along the river were swept away, and a section of the old Commerce Street was replaced with the new Connecticut Boulevard. This thoroughfare joined the new bridge to the foot of State Street. On the left is a section of the 1896 Atlas of Hartford. It shows that at that time there was still standing a row of structures associated with Hartford's early days as a river port along Commerce Street, between State Street on the south and Ferry Street on the north. On the right is the same area depicted in the 1909 Atlas. It shows that the old buildings had been replaced. Luckily, they were photographed before they were taken down, and their histories were recalled in the Hartford Courant newspaper before they were lost forever. Keep watching this video to learn about these buildings and the old days along the Connecticut River in Hartford, Connecticut. From its earliest days, the city of Hartford, Connecticut was vitally connected to the Connecticut River. 200 years ago, the city's waterfront was crowded with ships, and its warehouses were filled with produce and merchant goods. Hartford was incorporated as a city in 1784, and its original seal, adopted the following year, features a representation of the river as an old man crowned with rushes, who holds an urn with a stream gushing from it and a net filled with fish. Nearby are bushels and barrels. As William Deloss Love wrote in his 1914 book, The Colonial History of Hartford, quote, "There is no more appropriate device in which to symbolize the sources of Hartford's early development than this first seal. It sets forth the indebtedness of the town to the Connecticut River, that was the great highway to their settlement from the outside world. To it they committed many a venture for distant ports. It provided their tables in season with the choicest fish, it fertilized their meadows, and it brought to their homes many coveted luxuries. Thus it was the main artery of their early life." Unquote. This is a section of Love's map showing the early house lots of Hartford north of the Little River in 1635. The growing town's earliest wharves and warehouses were located in the vicinity of what was known as the Landing Place, Hartford's original ferry landing that was connected westwards across the Little Meadow to the road that ran from the Little or Park River on the south to the North Meadow. This north-south road would later become Front Street and is now called Columbus Boulevard. During the colonial period, though, the warehouses were relatively small, and the commercial activity along the river was still limited compared to what would come in the years after the Revolutionary War. This section of the 1824 Plan of Hartford shows that by that time, during the heyday of Hartford's river trade, there were 20 wharves between the mouth of the Little River at Dutch Point to Morgan's Bridge on the north, which was the city's first bridge across the Connecticut. It opened in 1809, approximately where the Bulkeley Bridge is located today. Zooming into the center of this area, by this time, the colonial path to the ferry landing was known as Old Ferry Street. It would later be renamed Kilbourne Street. Just to the south was a new Ferry Street, which led to a second public landing place and ferry established in the 18th century. An engraving which appeared on early policies of the Hartford Fire Insurance Company depicted a fire in a building at the foot of Ferry Street in 1811. As the Hartford Courant noted retrospectively almost a century later, quote, "The foot of Ferry Street was one of the busiest places in the city. The ferry, landing the farmers from the east side of the river who, with all their produce, gathered in the locality to barter and trade. The big warehouses down there were built in 1808, but the ferry was run long before the original bridge was built. Much business was transacted at the ferry, for besides being a gathering place for farmers who had produce to sell and who came to town to make purchases, it was also the headquarters of rivermen and fishermen, and there was a Fulton Street market on a small scale there." Unquote. The view in the image is eastwards towards the Connecticut River. Shown on the riverbank is an example of the shipbuilding activity that was flourishing at the time. In the distance, the image depicts the 1809 bridge across the Connecticut River, depicted here in a later imagining of what the area might have been like. It lasted less than a decade, Part of the bridge collapsed under the pressure of ice in March of 1818. Ferry Street was originally known as Jones Lane. By the late 18th century, 25 acres of land south of Jones Lane and east of Front Street were known as Pantry Jones's pasture. Named for John Pantry Jones, the land had been amassed starting with his great-great-grandfather, William Pantry, one of the original proprietors of Hartford, who'd arrived with Thomas Hooker. The buying up of acreage culminated in the 25 acres owned by John Pantry Jones's grandfather, John Pantry. As William DeLoss Love wrote of Pantry Jones, quote, "His homestead and adjoining pasture occupied a considerable area. It was through the southern part of this tract, then owned by his son, Nathaniel Jones, that Lower State Street was opened in 1800. In 1781, Pantry Jones deeded to Barnabas Dean and Company the lot near the river, long occupied by their distillery and store. Perhaps the latter building was erected earlier by Pantry Jones. This firm was formed in 1779. It is said that General Nathaniel Greene was a silent partner. Northwest of the distillery, there was a blacksmith shop known as Ensign's. Along Ferry and Kilbourne Streets, the greater part of the business life in this section gathered." Unquote. Besides Nathaniel Greene, the other silent partner of Barnabas Dean, who by the way was the brother of Wethersfield's Silas Dean, was the wealthy Hartford merchant Jeremiah Wadsworth. Greene and Wadsworth concealed their involvement due to their prominence in the ongoing Revolutionary War at the time. Barnabas Dean and Company's ships supplied the distillery with molasses produced by enslaved labor in the West Indies. John Pantry Jones was himself a merchant. 2 notices he placed in the Hartford Courant are shown on the left. In one, he and 2 other merchants advertise that they are selling potash kettles and coolers, and in another, Jones describes a black mare he had caught swimming across the Hartford ferry. Quote, "The owner, on proving his property and paying charges, may have her again, of the subscriber at Hartford Ferry, John P. Jones." Unquote. According to DeLoss Love, Pantry Jones erected a ferry house at the foot of Ferry Street, which he bequeathed to his nephew, John Jones, in 1794. Now I'll talk about some buildings located on Commerce Street between State and Ferry Streets. First, there were 2 houses, both of 3 stories, shown in this picture in circa 1905. They faced east towards the river and the train tracks, which came through in 1871. In this photograph, from the Samuel Taylor collection at the Connecticut Museum of Culture and History, the houses are numbered 1 and 2. A note on the back of the picture explains that building number 1 was the residence of John Pantry Jones, quote, "who kept a store at the corner of Ferry and Commerce Street, known as the Gridiron, who in his later life farmed in South Windsor." Unquote. This John Pantry Jones, born in 1791, was the grandson of the John Pantry Jones I was just describing earlier. His son, yet another John Pantry Jones, was born in 1832. A successful farmer, in 1882 he erected a notable stick-style house on Main Street in South Windsor. His brother, Nathaniel Jones, was profiled in a 1933 article in the Hartford Courant on the occasion of his 93rd birthday. The article declared that he was a militant Democrat, having voted for every Democratic presidential candidate from George B. McClellan in 1864 to Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933. Jones said he was glad to have lived to see another Democratic president in office, reminding him of the days of Grover Cleveland and Woodrow Wilson, and he looked forward to voting for FDR again in 1936. Sadly, Jones passed away in 1934. House number 2 is described as the residence of the father of State Railroad Commissioner John W. Bacon. Born in 1827, his parents were Leverett W. and Sarah Watson Bacon. In his long career working as a civil engineer for various railroads, Bacon completed such projects as the construction of Hartford's Union Station. He later settled in Danbury, Connecticut, where he died in 1907. That was not long after his old family homestead in Hartford was slated for demolition. The riverfront area had been a prosperous neighborhood in Bacon's youth, with some of the city's finest houses, but by the later 19th century, these residences had become tenements and warehouses. As the Hartford Courant described on September 8, 1905, the former Bacon house, quote, has borne an unsavory reputation in the neighborhood for some time, unquote. Morgan G. Bulkeley, head of the commission overseeing construction of the new bridge, was seeking to purchase the house, but its owner wanted $10,000, quote, a sum which surprised the commission. Arguments were used to induce the owner to change his price, but without avail, and Senator Bulkeley did not make the trade. It is rumored that the commission will resort to condemnation proceedings in the Superior Court under the law of eminent domain, as the commissioners have no intention of paying the price demanded by the owner of the property, unquote. Next to these two old houses was a more recent structure. It was T.J. Blake & Son, Brass Foundry and Copper Works. The business was started by Thomas J. Blake. Born in New York in 1834, where he learned the coppersmithing trade, Blake spent a brief time in Elmira, New York, before coming to Hartford in 1856. After a 5-year period working for Conrad Whitmore on Charles Street, and a brief stint for Colt Patent Firearms, Blake in 1861 began his own business, which was located first on Charles Street and then Ferry Street before moving to 141 and 143 Commerce Street in 1895. Tom Blake was a volunteer firefighter and served for 25 years as a fire commissioner, and for 17 years was on the Board of Selectmen. Like Nathaniel Jones, Blake was a lifelong Democrat, casting his first presidential vote the year he arrived in Hartford, 1856, for James Buchanan. Tom Blake retired at the end of June 1905 and passed away 4 months later. His son, Edwin J. Blake, who'd become a partner in the business in 1883, took over and transferred operations to Windsor Street at what's now the corner of Pavilion Street. This was to make way for the demolitions of that year and to increase the size of his facilities. Edwin died in 1925, and the firm was reorganized as the Blake Foundry Corporation. The company went into receivership in 1932 and ceased operations 5 years later. However, its former buildings still survive at the corner of Windsor and Pavilion. Just north of the T.J. Blake & Son property on Commerce Street was a 3-story stone structure at the corner of Ferry Street. Built in 1840, it was Asa Farwell's wholesale and retail liquor store. This photo was taken circa 1905, before the buildings I've just been talking about were torn down. But by the time of this photo, taken in 1906, the Pantry Jones, Bacon, and Blake structures were all gone, leaving only Farwell's old stone building. The demolitions uncovered the rear of the buildings just to the west, which, like the Farwell building, faced northward onto the south side of Ferry Street. This photo shows the Ferry Street side of these buildings. Farwell's warehouse and the neighboring building on Ferry Street were demolished in early 1907 after being condemned by the city. Around that time, articles in the Hartford Courant recalled the building's early days over a half-century earlier. Quote, "There still live a few old men who once went down to Asa Farwell's stone warehouse to drink cherry bounce for their stomach's sake. The liquid consisted of St. Croix or Jamaica rum, in which wild cherries had been put a few months before." Unquote. Local boys would earn silver coins picking cherries for merchants like Asa Farwell. Some also recalled the velvet suit Farwell wore among his casks of liquor. Quote, "And the customers were allowed to take a glass and help themselves. A dealer in that locality would be ruined now if he followed such a custom." Unquote. Also, quote, "In his day, Commerce and Ferry Streets contained as respectable residences as Main Street itself, but for some years his storehouse has sheltered rags and junk instead of the rare liquors of Asa's day." Unquote. Farwell amassed a substantial fortune, and in 1848 he erected a grand 3.5-story townhouse at the corner of Main and Grove Streets. It was said that the profit from one glass of his famous cherry bounce paid for one brick of the house. Designed by the architect Henry Austin of New Haven, the house cost $75,000, and, according to tradition, Farwell paid the entire sum in advance with money he kept in a wooden chest in his warehouse. The money was in many forms, including gold and silver, as well as American, British, French, and Spanish coinage, and the paper notes of various Hartford banks. The house was later converted to offices, and shortly before Farwell's old warehouse was torn down, the house was taken down for the construction of the first section of what would become Travelers Tower. As for the old warehouse, as I mentioned, it was replaced in 1908 by Connecticut Boulevard. But that was not the end of lost buildings that once existed at this corner of Ferry Street. As shown in this section of the 1922 Sanborn Insurance Atlas of Hartford, a new structure was built in that year right at the curve of Connecticut Boulevard where Farwell's warehouse had once stood. Also shown in this aerial postcard view, the new building was a municipal bathhouse for the use of East Side residents, similar to one that had recently been built in Pope Park. With facilities for 30 baths at one time, 20 for men and 10 for women, it accommodated twice as many people as the previous and inadequate East Side public bathhouse, which had been located in the former quarters of the fire department's engine company No. 3 on Front Street. As the Courant reported on October 20th, 1922, quote, "The main entrance will be separated, providing a lobby and waiting room for the men and one for women. A distinct advantage over the old building is that there is ample space for waiting room. It was often necessary to form lines on Front Street. A spacious lawn will be graded in front to provide for waiting children. The foundation and roof of the structure are of concrete, and the walls are of brick." Unquote. Of course, this area would be completely transformed in the late 1950s with the construction of Founders Bridge and Interstate 91. Even the bathhouse is now long gone. The modern waterfront along the Connecticut River at Hartford gives little sense of the lively dock area that thrived here in centuries past, back when the city was a significant trading port and transportation hub. Hi, this is History with me, Dan Sterner. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel as we delve into some of what was lost along the river over a century ago. Even before the construction of the interstate highways and the city's massive mid-century urban renewal projects, much of the old riverfront had already been long cleared of old maritime-era landmarks. That's because when the Bulkeley Bridge was erected in the first decade of the 20th century, the city of Hartford demolished many structures south of it to build a grand new boulevard that linked the bridge to the foot of State Street. And 30 years before that, other structures had also been lost when the Valley Railroad came through this area. In this video, I'm going to quote from several articles that appeared in the Hartford Courant newspaper between 1905 and 1908. These pieces give some of the history of what was being lost at the time and what the area was like in the old days. So let's get started. Quote, 60 years ago, the land now taken up by the boulevard was occupied by the best stores and residences of the city. 30 years ago, the residences had become tenements, and the stores were of the sort found in the tenement districts, or they had been turned into warehouses. Many of the old buildings that were raised by the Bridge Commission had no history of which to be proud. They were coal sheds or freight depots from the beginning, and never in their careers rose to more noble use. But others were once pointed out as ornaments to the city at a time when most of the city was east of Main Street and north of Sheldon Street. One of the most famous of all the old buildings to give way to the approach of the new bridge was a stone warehouse at the corner of Commerce and Ferry Streets. Though it looked as if it were built at the time of the pyramids, it was in reality constructed in about 1840 by Asa Farwell, who had then made a comfortable fortune. Beginning as a poor boy, he learned the confectioner's trade and prospered in it until he was able to carry on a trade with the West Indies and to deal in liquor, then as respectable a commodity as sugar. There still live a few old men who once went down to Asa Farwell's warehouse to drink cherry bounce for their stomach's sake. The liquid consisted of St. Croix or Jamaica rum, in which wild cherries had been put a few months before. There also still live men who as boys earned a few silver coins by picking wild cherries by the bushel for such merchants as Asa Farwell, and it takes a good many wild cherries to fill a bushel. The business prospered, and Farwell in his time was able to build what was the finest house in Hartford, and which stood at the corner of Main and Grove Streets on a part of the site now occupied by the Travelers Building. Tradition says that the house cost $75,000 and that Asa Farwell had the entire sum in cash before he commenced to build. He kept this fortune in a wooden chest in the warehouse. The money was in all sorts of forms, silver and gold of American, French, English, and Spanish coinage, with notes of Hartford banks, and when the chest was emptied, the house was finished. A few old residents still remember Mr. Farwell and the velvet roundabout that he wore while among his casks and hogsheads in the old stone warehouse. In his day, Commerce and Ferry Streets contained as respectable residences as Main Street itself, but for some years his storehouse has sheltered rags and junk instead of the rare liquors of Asa's day. The history of the old Valley Branch Station, which stood on the south side of State Street and has been replaced by a neat structure north of State Street because of the boulevard improvements, is of much interest to Hartford and her people. The building was erected by Edwin Taylor in 1835. It was 3 stories high with a slate roof, the first story of stone, and above that of brick. Mr. Taylor kept a grocery store there, and it was a great place for people to drop in on their way to and from the steamers which plied between this city and New York. There was then no other means of travel from Hartford to New York than stage and the steamers, and naturally most people preferred the steamers. The line of steamers was owned by the Vanderbilts, and one of the boats, the Water Witch, had for its captain Jacob Vanderbilt, the brother of the old Commodore Cornelius Vanderbilt. It was not an uncommon thing for the Commodore and his brother to drop into Mr. Taylor's grocery and sample some of the choice St. Croix rum with a little West Indian molasses stirred in, which Mr. Taylor always had on hand. The advent and the departure of the New York boats was then something of an event. Almost all Hartford gathered there, its fair women and brave men, to see the boat depart or to greet guests arriving, for the fashionable part of Hartford was Front Street, where the best families lived. Hacks, carriage, and wagons were so thick on the arrival of the boat in the morning that it was difficult wending one's way to the steamer, and it was the same in the late afternoon, when the people of this city, going to New York on business or pleasure bent, were escorted off by their relatives and friends. As soon as the upboat was seen rounding the bend below Dutch Point, up would go the flag on the storehouse, and for a long time a little cannon would boom out its welcome greeting. There were, in those days, almost as much excitement over the arrival and departure of the New York boat as there now is over the departure of an ocean liner for a foreign port. Charles Dickens, the eminent English novelist, landed at the foot of State Street on his first visit to Hartford in 1842, and Samuel Taylor remembers his coming here from Springfield in one of the old stern wheelers, or wheelbarrow boats, which navigated the Connecticut River at that time. He made another visit to Hartford in 1869 when he came here by rail. At that time, State Street was much lower than now, perhaps 4 or 5 feet at the east end, as evidenced by the doorway to the old building, which was set quite low in the street. And one result was that a light freshet would fill the street with water up to Commerce Street. In the spring of 1837, there was a light freshet and a high wind, and the roof of Mr. Taylor's building was blown off and went sailing into the Connecticut River. Mr. Taylor was somewhat discouraged and decided to give up the grocery business, and later on engaged in the lumber business on Dutch Point. Mr. Taylor sold the building, and a few years later it was sold again to John Smart, a machinist, who was in business there and lived with his family over the machine shop for many years. After his death, the building was sold to the railroad along about 1870 or 1871 and was used continuously as a railroad station until the new station north of the street was occupied. Almost directly opposite the old building stood, early in the last century, the big West Indian warehouse of Eliphalet and Roderick Terry, and the dock east of there was generally well covered with puncheons of rum and hogsheads of molasses, and a frequent sight was that of customers sampling the contents. A little glass receptacle would be let down into a puncheon of rum, a sample taken out. The prospective customer would take a mouthful, test its flavor by swishing it around in his mouth with his tongue, and would then spit out the spirit on the ground. After sampling a few puncheons, he would determine which he preferred at the price. The bung would be driven in again, a few chalk marks would indicate the purchaser, and the transaction would be closed. Long credit was given, and it might be 3 months before the customer paid for the puncheon of rum or hogshead of molasses, or oftener he gave a note which had a longer time to run. Molasses was brought in a similar manner, a stick being pushed in the bunghole, withdrawn, and the nature or quality of the contents being tested with the tongue. The same stick was used by everybody, microbes being unknown in those good old days. The Ferry Street Slip neighborhood was a busy mart many years ago. The big warehouses down there were built in 1808. The ferry was run before the original bridge was built. Much business was transacted down there in the olden times, and it was a gathering place for farmers who had produce to sell and who came to town to make purchases. It was also the headquarters of rivermen and fishermen, and there was a Fulton Street market on a small scale there. The locality was the headquarters of fish dealers. Nearly all the shad caught in the river was brought there, and boats filled with oysters and clams could always be found tied up to the docks. East of the fish markets was the steamboat office of M.W. Chapin, father of A.D. Chapin. Mr. Chapin said yesterday that his father conducted a line of propellers that ran between this city and Philadelphia. They carried freight, and the line was started before there were any railroads. He believed the line was withdrawn about 1878. During the Civil War, these boats were taken by the government and used to transport stores for the Army and Navy. At that time, Mr. Chapin replaced them with sloops, and after the war, he got his propellers back again. One of the warehouses was occupied by Zephaniah Preston as a feed store and grist mill. There was a trough there for horses so the farmers could feed them while doing their trading. He said he remembered the ship chandlery and it was south of the slip. The fish markets were mostly controlled by Sam and Bill Church. These markets were torn down when the Valley Railroad was built. One of the most notorious of the old buildings to be torn down to make way for the boulevard was the River House, which stood on the site of a grocery store, which was in turn replaced by a tenement house. George Robinson built the foundation of the tenement house, and after James Wilson had completed the building, it was used for a number of years as a hotel. The Bridge Commission bought the property of E. Newton Atherton. Mr. Atherton and his wife, who as Tilly Ashley has considerable reputation as an oarswoman, will probably move to California. Starting above the old bridge, the wharves as usually recalled were, first a lumber wharf called White's Dock that was near the present power station. Just below the bridge was the steamboat wharf, and just south of that the dock of the Union Line. The old ferry to East Hartford from the foot of Ferry Street came next, and then the Chapin and Burr Wharf. Daniel Buck and Company ran a steamboat line to New York from the foot of State Street, the ships sailing twice a week. Below was Flowers Dock, and Woodruff and Beach, manufacturers of marine machinery, had the next frontage, and it was here that a number of vessels were fitted up in the Civil War. It is reported that the frigate Hartford got her machinery here, and it is known that at one time as many as 4 converted war vessels were waiting in the river to receive their equipment. A private stone dock was just below this, and then came the gas company at the foot of Potter Street. The last dock was that of the Connecticut sawmill at Dutch Point. Unquote. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. You may have heard the name Dutch Point. No, I don't mean the restaurant called Dutch Point in Krakow, Poland. I mean the Dutch Point associated with Hartford, Connecticut. In the greater Hartford area, there are branches of Dutch Point Credit Union, whose logo features a quintessentially Dutch windmill. The credit union was founded in 1960 by employees of the Hartford Electric Light Company, now called Eversource Energy. The credit union was named for the old Dutch Point power plant in Hartford, which is long since demolished. Another association with the name Dutch Point in Hartford is the old Dutch Point Colony housing development. Once located between Willis Street and Stonington Street, just south of downtown Hartford, this development was erected in the 1940s as low-cost housing. It initially served as transitional accommodation for workers at the nearby Colt factory, and then for veterans returning from World War II. It soon evolved into permanent housing for impoverished people. The housing project was criticized from the beginning for its cramped, barracks-like units, but for many years it was well kept and civic leaders held it up as a model of city planning until crime and urban decay took a toll. In the early 2000s it was demolished and replaced by a brand new Dutch Point, a pedestrian-scaled affordable housing development laid out as a family-friendly neighborhood featuring rows of townhouses and a new community center. But where did the name Dutch Point come from, and where was the original Dutch Point in Hartford located? Dutch Point was a geographical feature This is a section from the 1877 bird's eye view of Hartford. The view is westwards with the Connecticut River in the foreground. It shows the armory of the firearms manufacturer Sam Colt and the surrounding factory village of Coltsville. To the west is the Church of the Good Shepherd, and west of that is where the Dutch Point Colony housing development was built in the 20th century. The original Dutch Point, though, was located just east of the church and north of the armory. It was a peninsula formed where the Park River, which now runs through an underground conduit, met the Connecticut River. This is the first of several videos I'm going to make about Dutch Point. In this video, I'm going to talk about the colonial origins of its name, and then a little bit about the point's shipbuilding and early lumber mill history. In my next video, I'm going to talk about Dutch Point's role in the great 19th century log drives down the Connecticut River. In the future, I want to also cover the Dutch Point power plant, highway construction, and the eventual loss of the peninsula when the Park River was buried. So stay tuned for all that, and remember to subscribe to this channel, History with Dan Sterner, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss anything. In 1614, the Dutch trader Adrian Block sailed past the future site of Hartford as he explored the area. In 1633, the Dutch established a trading post in the vicinity known as the House of Hope, which was fortified with a blockhouse and a palisade and was defended by a pair of cannons. This is a map that appeared in William Deloss Love's 1914 book, The Colonial History of Hartford. It depicts how the area would have appeared in 1636. Deloss Love believed that the fort would have been located on the west bank of the Park River, which was also called the Little River, just northwest of Dutch Point. South of the House of Hope was land along the Connecticut River claimed by the Dutch, and further south along the river was land occupied by Native Americans, including a fort. By 1636, the English, led by Thomas Hooker, had arrived, and, as the map also showed, they had already divided up much of the area that would become Hartford into house lots. This included the large lot of George Willis, where the famous Charter Oak was located. I made a video about the Charter Oak, which I'll link in the description below. In 1653, during the First Anglo-Dutch War, the English settlers seized the House of Hope, and soon after they took over and sold the remaining tracts of Dutch land in the vicinity. Jumping forward over 200 years, let's go back to the 1877 bird's eye view. The Dutch fort was long gone, but the name Dutch Point continued. In the 1800s, the Dutch Point Peninsula was used for two notable industries. One was a sawmill, and the other was shipbuilding. Shipbuilding at Dutch Point had a long history that went back to colonial times, when Hartford was involved in trade with the West Indies. This image from a stereograph shows Dutch Point in 1867. The view was taken from atop the Colt Armory, looking northwards. The Connecticut River is on the right, with the old wooden covered bridge in the distance. Coming in from the left is the Park River, and shipbuilding is underway at the tip of Dutch Point. A decade later, in 1877, the year of the bird's eye view, Charles C. Goodrich first established the Hartford and New York Transportation Company. It began as a tugboat company that towed freight on the Connecticut River. It soon expanded into a steamboat line, transporting passengers to and from its dock at the foot of State Street. The company took over the shipbuilding operation at the tip of Dutch Point. This old photograph shows the company's steamboat, the Charles H. Dexter, docked at Dutch Point. The company used the shipyard to construct vessels such as lighters, ferry boats, and barges that were used to transport coal. The coal originated in the mines of Pennsylvania and was transported by barge from Perth Amboy, New Jersey to Hartford, where it was delivered to the various coal yards that dotted the west side of the Connecticut River along Commerce Street, from Dutch Point up to what's now the Bulkeley Bridge. The movement of coal was facilitated by the existence of the Connecticut Valley Railroad, constructed parallel to the river in 1871. The railroad tracks cut across Dutch Point and crossed a bridge over the Park River. The photograph on the right shows the rail bridge as it appeared on August 31st, 1925. This is the 1867 view of Dutch Point that I showed earlier, and this is an 1872 lithograph depicting the area just after the railroad was built. As I mentioned, besides shipbuilding, the other significant industry on Dutch Point was the milling of lumber. In the mid-19th century, the lumber yard and steam sawmill near the tip of Dutch Point was operated by Henry Burgess and Son, as shown here on the 1855 map of Hartford County. Further north up the peninsula was the lumber yard of Edwin Taylor, who formed his first business partnership, Preston's and Taylor, in 1837. These partners took over an earlier mill operation on Dutch Point, which was started by a man named Noah Wheaton. That original mill was a landmark on the point until it burned down in 1849. Taylor rebuilt the mill and continued the business with various partners. But, as revealed in the 1869 Baker and Tilden Atlas of Hartford County, in 1861 he'd moved his operation from Dutch Point, which frequently experienced spring flooding, to a new mill and lumber yard off nearby Charter Oak Avenue, which enjoyed the protection of Sam Colt's dike. In its new home, the Edwin Taylor Lumber Company continued well into the 20th century, eventually passing to Taylor's sons, one of whom was Samuel Taylor, the noted collector of old photographs of Hartford buildings. Returning to Dutch Point, the lumber mill that Henry Burgess was operating burned down in 1860, and he replaced it with a new stone building. Burgess left Dutch Point in 1868, and his lumber operations there were taken over by the Hartford Steam Sawmill Company. An advertisement that the new company placed in the Hartford Courant newspaper noted that they were receiving a raft of pine and oak lumber from the waters of the Susquehanna River. They were also receiving 2 cargoes of southern pine timber and lumber from Georgia and Florida. The Hartford Steam Sawmill Company was eventually succeeded by the Hartford Lumber Company in 1876. This company would be getting its lumber from a different source. On September 27th of that year, the company placed a notice in the Courant declaring, quote, "Caution, we are now and shall be for several weeks floating a large lot of lumber in the Connecticut River. As some person or persons are in the habit of appropriating portions of them to their own use, this is to give notice that any person or persons found stopping them in their course, or driving them into iron spikes, or in any way mutilating them, will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, unquote. This floating lumber came all the way from forests in the far north of New Hampshire, and it was driven over 300 miles down the Connecticut River to mills in Massachusetts and to Dutch Point in Hartford. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. My last video was about the early history of Dutch Point in Hartford, Connecticut. If you haven't watched it, I'll put a link to it in the description below. Dutch Point, shown here in a section of the bird's eye view of Hartford of 1877, was a narrow peninsula formed where the Park River met the Connecticut River. The peninsula was home to a shipyard and a lumber mill. In this video, I'm going to talk about that lumber mill's role in the late 1870s and early 1880s in the massive log drives down the Connecticut River that each year brought millions of feet of lumber from the Connecticut lakes just south of the Canadian border in northern New Hampshire all the way down to Hartford. In 1876, the Hartford Lumber Company was established at Dutch Point. The president of this new concern was John Ross, a legendary lumberman from Bangor, Maine, who for years had been in charge of the log drives on the west branch of the Penobscot River in eastern Maine. A new era of massive log drives down the Connecticut had begun in 1869. And it continued for the next 46 years. These annual drives began each spring at the headwaters of the Connecticut in northern New Hampshire, just south of the Canadian border. Here, over the winter, rugged lumberjacks felled trees and piled up millions of feet of logs, awaiting the melting of the ice. Then the lumbermen became rivermen, guiding the logs as they floated on an epic journey over 300 miles down the river, through challenging obstacles that included dangerous waterfalls and treacherous narrows, as well as man-made obstructions such as bridges and dams, to reach sawmills at Northampton and Holyoke, Massachusetts. In 1876, John Ross would drive the logs even further south, to the sawmill at Dutch Point in Hartford. Ross and his partners had acquired about 100,000 acres in the town of Pittsburgh at the northern tip of New Hampshire. As the Hartford Courant newspaper described it on September 6, 1876, quote, "For 25 years no logs have been floated down the river as far as Hartford, and never at a period of such low water has anyone attempted to bring them down at all. But Ross, who is an experienced Maine lumberman, with a force of 100 men from the shores of the Penobscot, including 15 Indians, started on the 29th of May with about 18 million feet of spruce and pine logs, 6 million feet of which were destined for Hartford, 2 million for Holyoke, 4 million for Northampton, and the rest for various places above. On Thursday, the first few logs, they had been formed into rafts at the lower end of the Windsor Locks Canal, reached Hartford, and with them came a curious canoe-like boat, such as they use in log driving. With them, too, came Mr. Ross, the king of log drivers, bound to see the enterprise through to the end. The feat which he has accomplished is really a wonderful one, and excited great admiration among those persons up the river who were capable of appreciating its difficulties. He takes the lead with a few picked men, picks out the courses, and arranges the dams in such a way as to permit the passage of the logs. The men camp out on the riverbank at night, unquote. Ross and his men had indeed accomplished quite a feat. In fact, Hartford gamblers had laid odds of 5 to 1 that they would fail. It was incredibly dangerous work for the strong and agile North Country rivermen, who have been described as the cowboys of the East. They wore boots with inch-long spikes to keep their footing on floating logs, and they wielded a tool called a peavey or a cant dog, a long wooden pole with a metal spike and a pointed hook at the end. Log jams were a frequent hazard. While working to push the logs apart, sometimes a riverman would slip, get caught between the logs, and drown. Despite the danger, which led to several deaths a year, these fearless men would come back to the log drive season after season. As the Hartford Current described it on June 11, 1880, quote, "The Connecticut logger's main duty consists in preventing the logs from getting jammed, or starting them when they get stuck on sandbars, bridges, or other obstacles. For this purpose, teams of horses accompany each large collection of logs, or drive, as it is technically called. Notice must often be given in advance of the coming of the drive, for the sudden appearance of 20 or 30 million feet of logs, which is the number being floated down this season, may become quite a serious matter, especially if the jam extends 5 miles and cannot be broken up for several days, as happened last year at 15 Mile Falls, New Hampshire." Unquote. As time went by, the loggers used dynamite to more efficiently break up big log jams. In about 1879, the Hartford Lumber Company was succeeded by the Connecticut River Lumber Company, whose partners continued to drive logs down the Connecticut. As described in Picturesque Hampshire in 1890, quote, "The distance from the woods to Hartford and the dams at Holyoke and Windsor locks, besides the trouble made by logs with so many inhabitants in Holyoke, Springfield, and Hartford, as the logs floated without protection for many weeks past these places, soon convinced these men that Holyoke was the lowest place on the river to which logs could be profitably driven. In 1879, this company bought the Mount Tom Mill and all the business interests connected with it from the McKindo's Lumber Company. They also leased the Holyoke Mill from the Holyoke Lumber Company." Unquote. The mills at Mount Tom and Holyoke each had double the capacity of the mill at Dutch Point. For several more years, however, logs would still be brought as needed from the great boom at Mount Tom down the river to another boom just above the railroad bridge in Hartford. In some years, this lumber was shipped even further than Hartford for milling. On September 19, 1878, the Current reported that the last of 3 monster timber rafts, each consisting of 2 million feet of lumber, was being formed just below the Hartford Bridge. These rafts were then pulled by tugboats down the river to Long Island Sound and then to a sawmill in New Haven. This postcard shows a similar log raft on the Mississippi River. The article continues, quote, "The shipment of this raft nearly exhausts the supply of logs that have rested in the great boom above the railroad bridge since their arrival from the headwaters of the river early in the summer. But the company has a large part of last winter's cutting yet in the boom near Holyoke. It is expected that a large part of these will be brought downstream this fall and stored at the great log pile on the bank of Little River just above Dutch Point. At this place, for a distance of over 200 yards, logs are pulled up to a height of from 20 to 40 feet. These are drawn from the river and piled up at an expense of less than a cent for each log. The outer ends project some distance into the river, barely leaving a channelway, but it is claimed that a freshet would not disturb them, as the higher ones are out of reach of the highest rise, and the lower strata are securely held by those above." Unquote. On June 7, 1879, the Current described another year's activity. Quote, "The main drive of 33 million feet is coming downstream under the management of nearly 300 men. On Monday last, the rear was just passing North Stratford, New Hampshire, about 100 miles from the starting point. The low water has occasioned considerable delay and trouble, and especially at 15-Mile Falls above McKindo's. For a distance of 15 miles, the river runs over a bed of broken rocks, and a good freshet is needed to prevent the lodgment of the logs. This main drive will be checked at McKindo's, the logs sorted, and it will then move downstream to the Mount Tom Mills. The greater part will be held there, and only 13 million feet will be sent to Hartford, reaching here probably in August. For 2 weeks past, the supply of logs at the Hartford mill has been exhausted, and until the arrival of fresh material, the works will be comparatively idle, and the machinery repaired and put in complete order for the fall and winter campaign." Unquote. Another current article, this one from July 24th, 1882, also describes the log's journey to the Hartford boom, and continues, quote, "From this boom, the mill here is now being supplied. It has used up in a single day 319 logs, and made them into beams, joists, boards, lath, and kindling wood. No part of a log appears to go to waste. Even the sawdust finds its place in supplying fuel to the furnace. The mill has, during the winter and spring, used up the thousands of logs that were drawn in last year into Park River, or, as it is termed around Dutch Point, where its odors are known, Park Sewer. Again this summer, the banks of the river will be piled up with logs, shingled, the lumbermen call it, because as drawn up, one overlapping the other, the mass looks not unlike a shingled roof. The logs will be towed down from the boom above the bridge by a tug. The company's busy, puffing little owl, whose black, shapely hull is a familiar sight on the river. The company will send no rafts of logs this year at least to New Haven. 3.5 million feet were rafted there last summer, consigned to the New Haven Steam Sawmill Company. The Hartford Company thinks it can make quite as much money cutting up the logs at its own mills as by selling them." Unquote. By about 1885, it seems that the log drives had ceased coming as far south as Hartford. In 1889, the Current described the company's sawmill at Dutch Point as disused, and there were strenuous objections in the neighborhood when the company arranged to provide space on its property to a bone-boiling works, which were guaranteed to emit foul odors over a wide area of nearby Coltsville. In 1897, the former sawmill was being rented to the neighboring shipyard of the Hartford and New York Transportation Company when the old building burned down in a fire. While Hartford was no longer participating in the log drives, they continued from New Hampshire to Holyoke each year under the direction of George Van Dyke, the millionaire lumber baron who was known as the Lumber King of New England. Later, in 1897, there was an accidental return to the old days, when a June flood loosened over 20 million feet of logs at the Holyoke boom and sent them down the river. An emergency boom had to be constructed near the railroad bridge in Hartford to gather the errant logs, and the city issued a permit allowing the Connecticut River Lumber Company to erect a temporary mill at Dutch Point to saw the reclaimed lumber. On August 8, 1909, George Van Dyke, King of New England lumbermen, was at Turner's Falls, Massachusetts, observing by automobile the progress of his latest log drive, containing 53 million feet of lumber. He'd instructed his driver to stop the car at the edge of an embankment above the river. But when they were about to leave, both men were killed when the vehicle accidentally went over the edge, falling 75 feet. The great log drives finally came to an end 6 years later, in 1915. This was due to several factors, such as the depletion of the northern forests and the expenses the company was incurring from lawsuits that kept cropping up over the drive's disruption of all other traffic on the river and the damage that the logs caused to bridges, dams, and farmers' meadows. According to one member of the company, interviewed by the Hartford Courant on July 24, 1882, quote, "There is expense everywhere, and it is a curious fact that few would think of, that we have to pay thousands of dollars every year for land damages. Why, we practically pay the taxes of the farmers all along down the river to Mount Tom or below. The high water sends some logs over upon a man's land, and he comes up with a claim for damage to his mowing for more than the land is worth. And a country jury seldom has much mercy for a corporation. We paid out thousands of dollars for this item alone last year." Unquote. Please hit the like button and remember to subscribe to the channel and hit the notification bell. Do you know where I am here in the city of Hartford, Connecticut? What is all this, and what used to be here? If you want to find out, keep watching this video. Hi, this is History with me, Dan. Since colonial times, the landscape of the Connecticut River as it flows past Hartford, Connecticut, has gone through a lot of changes. Many today lament that the construction of Interstate 91, which runs parallel to the river, completed a process that separated the city from its once active riverfront. In more recent years, the organization Riverfront Recapture worked to create a riverfront park system that has made the river accessible again. Their centerpiece is Mortenson Riverfront Plaza, completed in 1999 just south of Founders Bridge. Further south, below downtown Hartford, is the outflow for the Park River Conduit. The Park River, also known as the Little River or the Hog River, used to flow through downtown Hartford. At the point where it met the Connecticut River, there was a narrow peninsula known as Dutch Point because there had been a Dutch trading post in the vicinity in the 17th century. In the aftermath of the Great Floods of 1936 and 1938, the Army Corps of Engineers placed the Park River through an underground conduit. The section from Bushnell Park to the Connecticut River was completed in the 1940s, and from that time on, Dutch Point was no longer a peninsula. Underground, the engineers redirected the river to flow in a more direct line, meaning that the current outflow is now north of what had been Dutch Point. The water level of the Connecticut River was quite high when I took this photo, but it was even higher when I took this photo over 2 months later. Just downriver from the conduit is a building located right on what was once Dutch Point. This is the old intake well that was part of the Dutch Point power plant. The intake well seems to have been built in about 1920. The power plant itself existed here for 58 years, from 1904 until 1962. In 2 previous videos, I've talked about the earlier history of Dutch Point. I'll link to them in the description below. In this video, I'll give a bit of history about the power plant, which survived the great floods of the 1930s and the burying of the Park River, but did not survive the coming of the interstate highway. And stay tuned to the end of the video, where I'll show what the area of Old Dutch Point looks like today. Please watch to the end so you don't miss it. From colonial times until the end of the 1800s, Dutch Point had been the site of shipbuilding and lumber mills. This is a section of the 1900s Sanborn Atlas of Hartford. It shows Dutch Point just a few years before the power plant was built. The blue building in the middle built of stone, had once been the sawmill of the Connecticut River Lumber Company. But by 1900 it was being used as a rag warehouse by the paper makers P.J. Kelly and Company. Later that year, the building was taken over by a new firm, the Hartford Board Company, which produced binders board for bookbinders. One of the directors of the company was Thomas F. Garvin of the well-known paper business on State Street. Just over a year later, on February 20th, 1902, this paper mill was destroyed in a fire, although it seems the company soon rebuilt. The yellow buildings on the right were part of the shipyard of the Hartford and New York Transportation Company. The company transported passengers and cargo on the Connecticut River, and it built vessels at Dutch Point such as tugboats, lighters, and ferry boats. In 1904, the wooden buildings of the shipyard were taken down, and the first section of the new power plant rose on the spot. The Hartford and New York Transportation Company moved its shipbuilding operations to a new yard on the East Hartford side of the river. On August 23, 1904, the Hartford Courant newspaper reported, quote, "For a week or more, the work of preparing the site for the Hartford Electric Light Company's new powerhouse at Dutch Point has been underway, and all hands have been on the watch for relics, but nothing better than old tin cans and such stuff has been brought to light. It had been hoped that the old Dutch fort might be dug up, but no sign of it has been seen," unquote. The reporter concluded, quote, "The site of the old fort cannot be definitely located anyway, for the Connecticut has been shoved eastward and Park River westward, so that the site may now be buried many feet under river deposit, and may be far from the present junction of the two streams," unquote. Before building the Dutch Point facility, the Hartford Electric Light Company, HELCO, which was chartered in 1881, utilized a plant on Pearl Street in downtown Hartford, shown here in 1902. The previous year, HELCO had installed here a massive steam turbine manufactured by Westinghouse. Nicknamed Mary Ann, it was the first steam turbine in America installed by a public utility. Within just a few years, Mary Ann would be laboriously moved to the new plant at Dutch Point. The need for the new plant was so great that it was built very quickly. Excavation of the site began in August of 1904, and its first new turbine was activated on December 18th. As the Courant described it on December 23rd of that year, quote, "So the Dutch Point plant was projected and was carried to successful completion in the remarkably rapid time of 4 months. Completion, in its application to this subject, is a relative term. The plant is not by any means completed, and it will probably be May before the plant has the handsome parlor-like appearance of the Pearl Street plant. But the electrical fluid is being made there and delivered for use, and it's now only a question of time to thoroughly equip the building and finish it so that all the electricity generated by steam in this city will be made there, and the plant on Pearl Street will only be used as a distributing point," unquote. In another massive effort in July of 1905, Mary Ann was moved to the Dutch Point plant in sections. The most difficult to handle was the turbine's unwieldy base, which weighed at least 21 tons. No truck in the city could handle it, so a special one had to be brought in from New Haven. Mary Ann would remain in operation at Dutch Point until replaced by a new Westinghouse-Parsons turbine in 1908. The power plant originally had just one large smokestack, which is visible in the background of this photograph of boats preparing for the river parade that celebrated the opening of the Bulkeley Bridge in October of 1908. The smokestack had just been painted for the first time the previous year. On April 12, 1907, A current reporter described the trapeze-like activities of the painter A.S. Pettibone of Bristol, who was known as Steeplejack. Quote, "Yesterday morning he climbed up the ladder, which is on the south side of the stack, and fixed up his rigging at the top, which would support him as he swung about the tall tower in midair. Then he came down, painting as he came, on the south side. He quit when he had done that side, though there was a considerable part of the afternoon still left. The nerve-wearing that is sure to come with such a trade, and the continued muscular strain necessitates a man working a shorter day than his fellows who are at other trades. Today he will start again on the other side." Unquote. The reporter noted that a small group of spectators gathered to watch Pettibone at work, and concluded, quote, "If Dutch Point were not so far from the center of the life of the city, the painting of the tower would undoubtedly call forth much more attention and comment than it has." Unquote. In the following years, the power plant would go through a series of expansions that greatly increased its size and capacity. By 1920, it had sprouted many more smokestacks. This lithograph shows the area of Dutch Point viewed from the Colt Armory in 1872, back when shipbuilding and sawmilling dominated. And this view shows the same area with the fully expanded power plant circa 1918. Notice Travelers Tower under construction in the distance on the left. By 1917, Dutch Point had reached the limits of its possible expansion, but the city had ever-increasing demands for energy. That year, Helco acquired more land about a mile south of Dutch Point, down the Connecticut River, and in December of 1921, the new South Meadows Power Station opened to great fanfare. It was hailed as a model of efficiency and low operating expenses. As the Current noted on December 18, 1921, quote, "So thoughtfully and carefully has the planning and building been done that it will require only about 60 employees to operate the station at 70,000 kilowatt capacity. The Dutch Point station requires about 120 employees for 36,000 kilowatt capacity." Unquote. I mentioned before that Helco was a pioneer back in 1901 in using a steam turbine. Well, in 1923, the company installed another new experimental turbine at Dutch Point, one that ran on mercury vapor instead of steam. It was eventually damaged and shut down in 1927, but the following year the company completed a substantial new addition to the South Meadow plant, which contained the first commercial mercury cycle generating unit in the country. Despite the health hazards of mercury, it continued in use until it was replaced in 1948 by a new unit, and that one was finally retired in 1961. As for the South Meadow Power Complex, shown here in 1922, it still exists, and like Dutch Point, it was much expanded over the years. In the 1980s, the facility was converted to a trash-to-energy plant, which ceased operation in 2022. Turning from South Meadow back to Dutch Point, a comparison of the area in an atlas from 1909 on the left and one from 1922 on the right reveals how much the complex had grown after the final alterations to the property in about 1920. The shape of the land at the tip of Dutch Point had been changed, becoming more angular. The company also erected a bridge near the mouth of the Park River and a long coal conveyor that crossed high above the train tracks and the Park River to connect to Helco's property along Sheldon Street. The coal conveyor is shown here crossing above the river in a photo taken on August 31, 1925. Just over a decade later, Hartford experienced the infamous flood of 1936, which inundated Dutch Point. This photograph shows both Hartford power stations during the flood. While all the equipment at Dutch Point was submerged, the South Meadow station was built much higher, so its equipment remained mostly dry and operational, although its transformers were in water 8 feet deep. Helco employees worked valiantly to keep the power flowing. The lights eventually went out at South Meadow, and the Current reported the harrowing story of a plant worker who went into an elevator on an upper level. In the dark, he pressed what he thought was the button for the generator floor, but he'd actually pushed the button for the lower floor that was flooded. The elevator soon filled with water up to his neck, and he couldn't find the button to raise the elevator up. Luckily, he was rescued after shouting for help. As I said, this flood, which was followed by another big one in 1938, led to the decision to bury the Park River. This massive project was one part of a series of flood control measures that included erecting dikes along the Connecticut River and a flood wall to protect Dutch Point. Work on the initial section of the Park River conduit under downtown Hartford was completed in the early 1940s. In 1945, the State Highway Department undertook a new project, the construction of an expressway above the conduit. Heading from downtown, it went from the new Pulaski Circle to the Connecticut River, just above Dutch Point. It then continued south along the Connecticut River, past the Dutch Point power plant, passing under the plant's coal conveyor. It then proceeded to the Charter Oak Bridge, which opened in 1942. The bridge is just north of the South Meadow power plant. The original Charter Oak Bridge, shown here, was replaced by a new bridge in 1991. The new expressway was initially named the Conland Highway, after Henry F. Conland, publisher of the Hartford Current and chairman of the Bridge Commission, as is shown in these old postcards. But it was quickly renamed the Whitehead Highway in honor of Ulmont Irving Whitehead, Jr., who was killed at Pearl Harbor. This aerial photo shows the new highway, the Charter Oak Bridge, and both power plants, as well as the Colt Armory with its distinctive onion dome. The days of shipbuilding and milling lumber were long past at this point. This view also shows the seawall, still in existence today, that was built in the early 1940s. In the early 1960s, the section of the highway along the river became part of I-91, while the section of the old expressway connecting Pulaski Circle to the interstate still bears the name Conland Whitehead Highway. The expansion of the highway to become an interstate spelled the end for the Dutch Point Power Station, which was demolished in 1962. So what is the area like today? Here's a photo of the plant circa 1918. As I said at the start of this video, the old intake well is all that survives of the original plant. On the right is the landward or west side of that structure today. It's still positioned midway along the seawall. If you follow the path along the river that stretches from Mortenson Riverfront Plaza on the north and Charter Oak Landing on the south, you pass right through where the power plant once stood. Between this area and the rest of the city, there are still train tracks and, of course, the highway just west of it. This photo is a view southwards, with the intake well and seawall on the left and the train tracks and highway on the right. This is a view northwards showing the full length of the seawall. And remember the coal conveyor that went over the Park River and later the highway? It would have started just beyond the fence straight ahead at the intersection of Sheldon Street with Charter Oak and Van Dyke Avenues. It's just down the street from the old Helco building, now Eversource, on Sheldon.